And I'm delighted to welcome everyone here to the 10th Annual Summit of the University's Fighting World Hunger. And I understand this is the second time that the conference has been here in Guelph. And the University of Guelph was the first Canadian university to join UFWH, the University's Fighting World Hunger. And we held the 6th Annual Summit here on campus in 2011. So the fact that you're back here bodes well for the university. Delighted to have everyone back here. And while the weather may be very, very cold outside, I hope that the reception that you have received here is a made in Guelph warm reception, as I have had since taking on my role here as president. Now, the University of Guelph has a long history of a commitment to teaching, research, and scholarship in the food and hunger-related areas and issues. It's been about 140 years, actually, since the Ontario School of Agriculture and the experimental farm began here in Guelph. So we have a long-standing tradition and a long history in the field. Today, the OAC, the Ontario Agricultural College, is the only one of its kind in the province, and really is a centerpiece, not just for the province, but I would say for the country. And more broadly, the University of Guelph, in part because of that, has gained the reputation or renown as Canada's food university. And that reflects the range of scholarship and food-related issues here, not just in the OAC, but across all of our colleges, including our College of Business and Economics. And this focus, I should say, reflects a more broad and pressing global issue that goes beyond the University of Guelph, and that is the need to ensure access to healthy, affordable food for all of the world's inhabitants. And this is a theme that I don't need to tell this group, but it's something that I'm reminded of constantly in my own role here, how it's becoming a more and more prominent theme in so many different ways around us. This weekend's summit is also a reminder of the need for action on a range of food security issues and related environmental, social, health, and economic factors. It's also a reminder of the efforts that will be needed to accomplish a few things. One, to meet the pending challenge of feeding a projected population of 9 billion people by the year 2050, to reduce food waste here and beyond here around the world, to develop sustainable agricultural tools to alleviate rural poverty and in developing nations. And universities, of course, are absolutely, I believe, central to these efforts. And beyond research and teaching, universities really do play all sorts of other roles, and in particular, they play also a service role. And indeed, if we're paying attention to food and hunger issues closer to home, with our students, for example, volunteering to collect food each year for area food banks, and that's just an example of the community engagement that goes beyond the core business of the university. This weekend, you'll hear about many of the challenges and opportunities, and you'll learn how researchers, students, and other campus community members, I would say, along also with the area business and other community leaders, are working to address hunger and poverty issues. And again, I'm absolutely delighted that you've chosen to have your summit here at the University of Guelph. And I'd like to just make sure I recognize a number of the event sponsors. Our lead sponsor, Elanco, the continued commitment, of course, of the World Food Program, the support from the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, the Alliance to End Hunger. We have a number of private donors who, through their generosity, are supporting this important event. And last but not least, our own chapter of Universities Fighting World Hunger and the university itself, including a number of our colleges, in particular, College of Business and Economics and our Ontario Agricultural College. And truly, without the support of these groups and organizations, the event just simply wouldn't be possible. So thank you so much for that. Thank you also to a number of people involved with leading the PUSH initiative, and which is a joint effort of university campuses across North America to advocate for action against hunger and poverty. And tell you to see that the mobilization that I've seen through this initiative is truly impressive, and it's a movement that I've become more aware of and understand, and very, very impressed. Among them, I have to applaud in particular June Henton and Harriet Gillis from the Auburn University, and Paula Hunker with the Hunger Solutions Institute there. They've been real advocates and movers and shakers in this initiative. As well, I know that our past president, Alistair Summerlee, has been a huge supporter and advocate as well. So without your support and determination, we wouldn't be here today. And let me take this opportunity just for a moment to thank our staff, students, and faculty who've made the summit possible. I understand that there are faculty, staff, and students who host a variety, from a host of university here, as well as others, including politicians, business leaders, and a number of civil society members from both sides of the border. So I hope you enjoy your opportunity to interact, work together this weekend, and that you also draw inspiration from each other. Again, welcome to Guelph, and I wish you all the very, very best. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franco. I know that the President has other commitments that he needs to go to, but thank you for being here. Let me provide a brief introduction to the community dialogue. This is actually the 6th dialogue that we have undertaken. They are intended to explore contemporary issues, and what could be more contemporary and more challenging than facing the prospect of trying to feed the world and feed the 9 billion people that we anticipate, or possibly more, who will be here in not very long a time. The dialogue is intended to be exactly that. It is unscripted. I have to acknowledge the patience of the panelists when I have written back to them saying, could I give a small presentation at the beginning? I'm sure you'll expect me to make some concluding remarks, and how long should my PowerPoint be? And I've deliberately said every time, I'm sorry, you are not going to be asked to do anything except to talk to each other and respond to questions. This is an interesting way of doing it. It is intended to try and spark genuine dialogue between people who, when I introduce them to you in a moment, come from very, very different backgrounds. In fact, one might never see this group of people together on the stage again. So you are seeing something that is completely unique. And part of the reason for doing that is that we all know that the issues we are trying to deal with are incredibly complex. There are many facets associated with them, and that there is not one single solution that we can come to. And so it is, I think, a case of dialogue between quite disparate individuals and interests that may lead to some common understandings and advise us about how to move forward. So with that said, let me introduce the illustrious group of people that I have. From your left, my right, starting with Brady Deaton Sr., and I say that because we actually have Brady Deatons on either end of the row of panels here. Brady Deaton Sr. is in fact the former Chancellor of the University of Missouri. He is the chair of the board of International Agricultural Development, BIFAD, in the United States, and has been a very significant voice in some of the absolutely phenomenal changes that have occurred in American foreign policy towards building a more sustainable tomorrow. Brady, thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Next, can I introduce Ajay Markandi? He is the Director of Liaison for North America from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the United Nations. He has an incredibly illustrious career of places and positions that he has held. For those of you that know me, one of the reasons that I am particularly drawn to him is that he has spent time in Cambodia and in fact has been awarded various honors and prizes in Cambodia for the work that he has done there, but that is by no means to belittle the work that you have done elsewhere. Ajay, thank you very much for being here too. Next then is Catherine Schmidt, and Catherine Schmidt is the Executive Director of Food Banks Canada. She has been absolutely amazing in trying to bring awareness to the whole issue of feeding people in Canada, and so you can see we're already going from global to local, and has been a tremendous voice in an ever increasingly challenging area with regard to feeding people in Canada. Next then is an empty chair which I will sit in and will be the person who will provoke these individuals into some discussion. And then on this side we have Sylvain Charlebois, who is from the College of Business and Economics. Many of you will know Sylvain. He is a frequent communicator in all kinds of different spheres, usually saying something that is provoking a significant discussion, eyebrows raised by a number of people, but he is a well-known advocate for thinking about how do we create a sustainable agricultural system. And then last but by no means least is the smaller version, younger version of the Brady-Deaton duo. Brady Deaton is the Macmillan Chair of Agriculture in the Ontario Agricultural College here, and has in some ways similar views, but my guess is there are also going to be some challenges between father and son in the kind of areas that they work in. Ladies and gentlemen, would you join me by welcoming these people? And now I'm going to do something that the panelists don't actually know about. And so I'm going to show a short film. It's a film that was actually made in 1949. And you'll see why it's relevant for the discussion that we're going to have today. And it's amazing, this is played automatically so many hundreds of times today, and it's not going to do it now. Come on. Okay, just talk amongst yourselves for a moment.
There'll be 55,000 more people for breakfast in the world than there were this morning. And the next day there'll be 55,000 more. And so on, at the rate of 20 to 25 million new mouths to feed in the world each year. But we're not producing 55,000 new cups of milk, or 55,000 new bowls of rice, or loaves of bread to feed them. And until we do, there can be no lasting peace in the world. Freedom can't be built on empty stomachs.
So spoke Norris Todd, Director General of FAO, United Nations. His words and those of his predecessor, Lord Boydor, ring out at conference after conference as they challenge men to solve the greatest problem of our time.
There is as great a need for all nations to join in a world food bank to develop the resources of the earth for the benefit of the people, and thereby bring prosperity and stability to agriculture and to industry, and what is equally important, to put an end forever to hunger and poverty which lead to social unrest and revolution. A World Food Plan which will achieve these great objectives can put the world on the road to permanent peace.
Hunger and starvation, the plague of civilization since the birth of mankind. This year, from the four corners of the earth, a group of men gathered in Canada to seek an answer to the problem of world food distribution. It was the third annual conference of the International Federation of Agricultural Producers at Guelph, Ontario. This is the worldwide organization of farmers which works with FAO to increase production of food and to influence their own governments to ensure that this food will reach the people who need it. These are not legislators. These are not lawmakers. These are farmers, representing millions of farmers in 22 member countries of the IFAP.
The IFAP is the most important of the many non-governmental international organizations. The Federation speaks for the farmers of all countries, and there are more people engaged in agriculture than in all other industries put together. This great federation must realize its responsibilities and its great potential power. It is the duty of the federation to advise governments on matters of food and agriculture.
And as the delegates took their seats, the words of that great humanitarian, the late Fiorello LaGuardia, hung over this conference. Gentlemen, you are dealing with the people of the world now, and you cannot fail them. Where one country has abundance and another country is in need, where within one country there are surpluses of food going to rot in warehouses and vast sections of the population are in hunger, there can be no surpluses. There can be no surpluses. And yet already embarrassing stockpiles of food are accumulating in the heavily producing countries. In Canada alone, 10,000 barrels of powdered milk, tons upon tons of canned peas, tomato juice, salmon, honey, and beans. These are foods that can be shipped anywhere, foods which will nourish the hungry, foods that will give health and strength to people in those countries which cannot feed their teeming populations. To lay a plan whereby this food would reach those parts of the world where it is so desperately needed, and yet give the farmer a fair return for his labor, this was the primary goal of the conference. It had already been partly achieved by the passing of the International Wheat Agreement. Under this agreement, 5 exporting nations will sell each year for 4 years at a guaranteed minimum and maximum price 450 million bushels of wheat to 30 importing nations. This agreement, repeatedly pressed for by the IFAP, gave farmers new incentive to produce without fear. The British delegate spoke for the conference.
IFAP hereby declares its support of the International Wheat Agreement and repeats its declaration of urgency of early ratification. We must ensure a continuing and plentiful supply of wheat for the people within a framework of orderly marketing for the producer.
The American delegation is of the opinion that after the endorsement of the International Wheat Agreement by the signatory governments, we shall have taken the first major step in translating our ideals into practical action for orderly marketing of wheat, the basic product in world trade. Through this agreement, hungry people will get bread, and farmers will sell their wheat.
Here in Canada, Mr. President, you've got everything. Good soil, scientific knowledge, and a machinery and trainment. You can produce enough for your needs, and even more. And we need more and yet more food. When I see your fine herds and farms, and when I think about hungry children and starving men and women, who have never tasted cow's milk at all.
Yet here the delegates saw a country where abundant food was a reality, not a dream. Touring Canada from east to west, they saw a land rich in agricultural products, rich in the know-how of mass production of food. From the orchards of the Annapolis Valley to the high-producing potato lands of the Maritimes, realizing the tremendous possibilities for production as they traveled through the highly diversified areas of the central provinces. They saw the great grain elevators at the head of the lakes, filled with millions of bushels of wheat from the fertile plains of the west. Here was food in abundance, and farmers who could produce more and yet more food if markets were assured, markets which already exist among a hungry 3/4 of the world's population.
I can't help feeling that if we don't do anything but find a way to get your surplus beef and milk powder in India, we will have done a good job.
A practical proposal by the Canadian and American representatives was presented by a Canadian delegate.
On behalf of the Canadian delegation, I therefore propose that an international agency and an international fund be established to carry out this special action program. To the FAO, we ask to recommend to their respective governments that this be done forthwith.
Under this plan, a needy nation would buy food at prices it could afford to pay, while the farmer received the normal market price for his goods. The difference between these two prices would be shared equally, half by the government of the producing country and half by the International Emergency Fund. In this way, empty stomachs would be filled and farmers could reap abundant harvests with confidence that their goods would be sold. This plan to establish an international fund to stabilize abundance for all was endorsed by the entire conference.
The resolution, having been proposed and seconded and fully discussed, is now before you for your decision. Will all those in favor of the resolution, after translation, please hold up the right hand.
Another World Food Conference has come to an end. A step has been taken toward removing the restrictions to trade which have kept so many of the Earth's people in hunger and in poverty. The farmers of the world have gone this far. It now remains for the people of the world to challenge their governments to act, to distribute the blessings of nature to all people.
There must be no such thing as surplus food in one place, but in other places, millions of people are hungry and some are actually starving. That's where the Farmers' Own World Organization, the IFAP, comes in. By proposing and giving bigger support to international action through FAO, we can get the so-called surplus foods to the people who need them. The IFAP will then not only help farmers who might otherwise be ruined by these so-called surplus foods, but it would contribute immeasurably to prosperity, peace, and human freedom. The world can and must grow far more food.
The farmers have offered a solution to the world's greatest problem. They challenge the world to make it work.
So you know what my first question is going to be. 65 years ago, we sat here and said, we're going to solve this. Why haven't we?
Not a multiple choice question?
Not a multiple choice.
Oh, it's open?
It's open, yes.
Step in.
Yes.
Yes.
I was just going to say, we haven't because we did not have people like you, June and Paula, leading the charge in the universities and government. I want to say that as just a way of commending the effort that you've made, and I mean that because what we're seeing today across the North American continent, certainly, and really internationally under this Universities Fighting Hunger initiative is unique. I don't believe that's occurred before. I don't believe there's been the consciousness among faculty and students on a university-wide basis or even a government-wide basis to recognize the need that is there. We have had so many policies developed that were very self-serving of the nation. That's always the case to some extent politically. But even during periods when we had surpluses of food, we don't really have food surpluses in the same sense today, The American people, for example, felt that the humanitarian instinct was such that it would result in food being distributed worldwide, production increasing, but without the kind of coalition of partnerships, I think, that have emerged in recent years. So my own sense is that for the first time in history, we really see the potential of eliminating the most extreme dimensions of poverty by the goals that have been brought together through most of the Western world, the African world, the Asian world that has come together to address these issues. So the institution building that has occurred, so to speak, the expectations that we really are going to do something, I think has inspired a whole new generation of university students from where I sit. And so when I look ahead, in spite of the fact that we've not achieved the goals that we expected to in 1949, there has been tremendous progress made, no question about that. I was just reflecting on the fact that the caloric intake per capita worldwide has roughly doubled since that conference. That's amazing. I think it was like 1,600 and some calories per person when I began college in 1960. And now it's over 2,800 per capita. So yes, that may be data to some extent. We have better data perhaps, but FAO has been there from the beginning dealing with these issues, and we've made progress, and I think now we see the potential of really closing in a very significant way because of the unique commitment of all sectors of our society.
But I mean, Catherine, would you agree? Because what you see within Canada is, in fact, going in the opposite direction, isn't it, in terms of the number of hungry people in Canada?
Yeah, we're seeing, since the most recent recession in 2008, we're seeing 25% more people come to a food bank each and every month than we were prior to that. So we're seeing close to 900,000 Canadians every month, about 1.8 million different Canadians each year. I think, I think that there's really, in Canada, there's two issues. One relates to this conversation where we do know there's a significant amount of food waste in this country. And being that safe, quality, nutritious food that's not being equitably shared with those who need it most, and that's where food banks come in. And I think the dialogue, this was actually quite depressing to watch where we were 65 years ago, but I think to your point as well, I think some things have changed. I mean, the dialogue on food waste right now isn't just with the agriculture producers, it's also with the food manufacturers and the retailers in this country, which I think is encouraging. But then I think the second piece of this is why in a country as prosperous as ours are we seeing so many people go hungry and not have access to the food that they want? And while food banks can provide that short-term solution to help people today, there's a bigger issue around incomes and government policy in this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One way maybe to organize the issues a bit is to, you get food either by producing it, which unfortunately much of the world is involved in, much of the hungry world is involved in food production. Purchasing it, which is I think some of the problems that we face more in, say, Canada, or it's some food transfer, which you're directly involved in, Catherine, and emergency food aid or food banks. These, and what you see kind of in the video a little bit is a food transfer kind of story, and I think one of the challenges, really one of the complex issues, is how to overcome food security by the production and by increasing the purchasing power of the people that are hungry. Mm-hmm. And I think another issue, we might debate a little bit, and AJ, this might be in terms of the data from FAO, but it's a debate, how we think about whether we have made a bit of progress. Mm-hmm. So if we look at absolute numbers, the figure you hear is when the World Food Summit met, they were looking at around 800 million hungry people, and they looked to the future at 2015, and they had hoped to cut it in half, but today there's about 800 million hungry people. But if you look in terms of the prevalence and the percentage terms in developing countries, you move from 23% roughly to around 13%. So in some ways, since that movie, we could debate it a little bit, but I think there has been some progress made. But I think the latter two categories are really, really important to the future of fighting hunger. That is increasing the capacity of people who are presently hungry involved in agriculture to produce food and to increase their ability to purchase it. And there's a lot of complexities within purchase.
Thank you very much. I think, Alistair, you started with and I think it comes across as well. I mean, the issue of food security is highly complex, and I think it's not going to be put into a soundbite and how do we want to look at it. And if you look at even apart from the 1949 sort of momentum that we got, we've had several iterations of trying to define what food security is since the 1970s and the world food crisis of the oil hikes, etc. And I think even then, what I see was in common between the narrative of 1949 and coming into the 1970s was a very supply-driven type of a response. Let's increase availability, availability, availability. And what I think the iterations through through FAO, but also with other multilateral organizations, we've tried to encapsulate some of that complexity into the definition of what food security now is. We still don't have a platform where we can look at food security to be actionable. What do we want to do around this agenda? And I think that's an important point that we need to probably discuss. But I had 2 points to just make following on from that, and thank you for sharing this. It was very, very illuminating. I think one of the things that we've been trying to say, even within our organizations like the FAO, the World Bank, etc., and certainly some of the more outspoken people who work for these organizations, is that the world has changed, but some of these organizations haven't kept pace. And I think that's an important point to look at it. So what is the role of the multilateral system, and where do we come in? But the idea, unfortunately, of looking at how do you, in 1949 we had this supply response. Let's look at minimum support prices. Let's look at guaranteed support prices to stimulate supply. Unfortunately, we've had that hanging on till even today. If you look at a lot of the problems that I've been working in India for the last year and a half, 2 years, is to do with MSPs. We haven't destructured it. And now we've come to a situation where we've got hungry people, but there is 28 million tons of rice and wheat sitting in your godowns. Because the supply response has been there. Prices are attractive, farmers are producing. So you're going back onto this, and I think what we really need to look at it and how we do it is very complex again, but I think at least the discussion has started to look at both supply side drivers and demand side drivers. And those are quite complicated because then it takes you into the arena of what politicians want to do, and they're normally quite short-sighted.
I absolutely agree with you in terms of when I was watching the movie, absolutely clearly came from farmers looking at the supply side without really considering how demand for food is actually quite complex to understand. It's getting worse. And so I know that we're not only talking about food security now, we're actually talking about nutrition security, which goes back to how we understand demand, to grow the right food for the right people in the right place. So we're often seeing failures in distribution, obviously. The equilibrium between supply and demand is always a complicated thing to strike. And it was real in 1949. It's still real today. But I actually felt optimistic while I was actually watching the movie. I do sense that there's been some evolution. There's been some significant progress over time. One example, if I may use, Catherine, who heads Food Banks Canada, I actually consider food banks as being one of humankind's best achievements when it comes to volunteerism. Without the help of government, we've seen an emergence of a highly efficient system to support the vulnerable. And we don't recognize it all that much. It's happening more and more. Britain, as an example, since 1990, the number of people visiting food banks has tripled. The system has kept pace, has adapted to respond to the needs of the needy. It's a huge accomplishment. And it was based, it's pushed by volunteers and not necessarily governments. So.
Did you want to respond?
Yeah, and I would just say I think that's a real testament, to those of you who are in the room right now and all those who are involved in the sector of sharing food that's there. It's a real testament that people care, we want to make a difference, and communities are coming together to do what they can do in their communities while there's other economic factors working on bigger picture issues. So it is a real testament. Here in Canada, actually, 40% of the food banks are run solely by volunteers, and none of the food banks would exist without that volunteer support, with no government or very, very minimal government involvement here in Canada. So it really is a response by each of us to what we're seeing happen with our neighbors across the country.
But is it ethical? Should we be? I don't disagree at all, and I think it's absolutely amazing that we have this incredible volunteer, caring community that has grown up and wants to make a difference. But the fact that there are now more and more people accessing these, and bearing in mind that most people have a challenge with dignity at least when they first start to access food in food banks. Is it a moral issue that we should be dealing with?
I believe it's completely unacceptable. We live in a country as prosperous as us, and yet we're seeing close to 1 million Canadians not be able to put food on their table and feed their kids. It's not an acceptable situation at all.
I think it's important. We don't want to celebrate, in a sense, the tripling of people going to Canadian food banks, and I know that's not what you're saying, but it shows that that's really how we address the issue. When I go back to these 3 pillars, you're producing it, you're purchasing it, and it's more complex than that, or we have food transfers. Food transfers are really an important part of how we deal with the problem as it presents itself to our citizenry. But if we go back, and I think this is what was kind of mentioned by Ajay and my father, it's those 2 other components that we have to get at: the production, the ability to produce it, and this may be more relevant to developing country scenarios, and then the purchasing power, the ability to be able to demand it, the ability to have incomes that allow you to escape having to go to the food bank. Yeah.
So I think that's an excellent point, but I think just going on to, and I think you made the point earlier as well, is that you need to look at the duality of agriculture and food production with the wider economy, and I think that's an extremely important relationship that you need to look at it. You can't look at it in isolation. So whether it's a rich country or a poor country, or emerging country, essentially in the developed world at the moment, we have seen that the transition from agriculture to other sectors has sort of worked, but you may see a regression happening for reasons that I'll give later perhaps. But in emerging economies, what we're finding, which is actually quite troublesome to some of us, and especially from an economic point of view, is that we're getting phenomena called jobless growth. That sectors outside agriculture do not need labor. It's not the traditional model anymore, that you're going to get manufacturing and you get services pulling off labor, and you'll get that duality that ag economists and us have been working on, is that you'll get productivity benefits on both sides. It's not happening. So that productivity gains in these sectors outside, certainly in India where I've been working a lot, has not been reflected in wages for unskilled agricultural type of labor. So we've got them stuck. So you're going to get that. The other thing that concerns me a little bit for the other type, even countries which have developed, is an article that I read several months ago now in The Economist, which was called Wealth Without Workers and Workers Without Wealth. The next generation is not, it's going to be technological. It's going to need a different approach to how do we look at income. How do we get the youth and the people who are coming onto the job markets today to find the types of employment that traditionally are going to die out?
Let me just ask you a question because I'm interested in that. If you look at the model, if you take 70% of the people, or 60 to 70% of the people in Africa, that are, many of whom are hungry, that are involved in agriculture, one part of that traditional model is raising the productivity of smallholder. And I guess that even though that is a traditional and it's part of the conventional story, it still seems to me to be fundamental.
It is great, but the point is that, for example, as economists, we'd say, well, do you need to produce that? I mean, does Africa need to produce its own food through its, I mean, at what cost does it come at? I mean, again, if you look at, and there are huge advantages that we can, in covering some of the productivity gaps and the yield gaps, and I agree to that. But you may want to go back to comparative strengths and advantages. Trade is a way of looking wider than trying to be the self-reliance thing. And one of the things I'm encouraged, again, in the context, sorry, I'm using India a lot, is just because the new government is trying to dismantle some of the, what I say is some of the impediments that have been there since the 1960s in our approach to all sorts of things, including agriculture and food production. And that is the way I think we need to go forward. Do you really need to produce all that food, but it's going to stick in huge storage and the rats eat it? Or do you want to exchange that for some comparative strengths? I mean, India has the advantage, of course, that it has a huge domestic market, and it's growing phenomenally. But why do we need to produce apples when we can import them? I mean, yeah, that's the argument that I put forward.
You have to get that, you have to get that second component. You have to get the purchase component. I always like to tell my students that when we think about development, we think about development countries that has this interesting characteristic, and that they're characterized by the capacity to trade over increasing distances with increasingly unfamiliar agents. So I don't know who made my coffee, but it happens somewhere farther off. So trade's important. But you still have 70% of the economy in some of these desert places in an agriculture sector. And how exactly you get that purchasing power to afford that drives that kind of trade is important.
Is look outside agriculture. Why the point is that we have a lot of people who stick. I mean, if you look at it in terms, it's disproportionate. There are drivers to this. I'm not disagreeing with you, but if you look at inward investment, public investment in agriculture since the 1980s, in relation to the contribution that agriculture makes to GDP, it's tiny. It's very little. But having said that, so there is already a case to be made that we should have much larger public investment into agriculture in the right areas. But in addition to that, the point that I'm trying to make is that in part, the solution that traditionally happened in countries like Canada, the UK, etc., had been driven by this duality. It meant that you were able to transition out. The fact is that if that comes to a halt, you've got a time bomb because you've got unskilled labor, especially women, who are not equipped. What are they going to do? Agriculture may or may not provide them employment even, because it will go a different way, and it's growing.
But it sounds to me, this will be my last point on this point. It sounds to me like you are saying the traditional model, that you want to get a manufacturing sectors moving and up, and the traditional story is you have agriculture productivity, then you develop a manufacturing sector. And I guess what you're saying is you want that manufacturing sector to maybe come first, or be forwarded, but you've still got this dual nature of you're trying to develop the manufacturing sector as part of it.
But that's okay. Last point, it's a policy issue as well. I mean, a lot of these things, like the minimum guaranteed prices, in fact, have distorted a lot of signals.
I was just going to pick up on the complexity issue and take it maybe a little more broadly than the very important dialogue that's going here. The changes that we've seen since 1949 are truly phenomenal in the world. If you look at the globalization of agriculture and communications, the Green Revolution, the international trade that has just been remarkable, that has led to more successful distribution of food worldwide, yet the problems of the smallholder persist, and in our country and your country and others, the income inequality that we're seeing today is driving more and more people to food banks, and this group has addressed that. Our students came back 3 years ago from this conference and said we have to have a food bank on our campus, which we did, and it was very successful. But the point I wanted to make was that with all these changes, in 1949 we did not have the CGIAR system worldwide, the Consultative Group on International Agricultural Research. That's a global institution that's been created. We've had the Green Revolution since that time. And we've had enormous returns on the research and education that's been invested in agriculture. Study after study has shown that. Bob Evanson at Yale and Wallace Huffman at Iowa State is probably the most famous elaboration of that thesis. So with all that, why do we still have the problems that we face is a fundamental issue. And it shows the complexity of what we're talking about and the need to draw on a broad range of our knowledge base to continue to fine-tune what we're doing and identify the kinds of policies that can make a more sustained difference over the long run. So I was just trying to put in context a bit that very important discussion that you've had there.
Maybe I can take us into another realm, and that is another challenge that we face as we move from dealing with food crises to something that's sustainable. So, I mean, we have experienced unbelievable challenges that we have seen, whether they are earthquakes or some kind of climate change. Most recently, of course, the Ebola outbreak in Africa, that create immediate and terrible emergency circumstances that we need to be able to respond to. Probably what's happening in West Africa is going to become one as a result of Ebola. But then how do you transition an area where you're engaging with emergency food response into something that's sustainable? Because, I mean, that's another area of great challenge, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the climate change is affecting food systems all over the world. Whether you have too much water or not enough water, it's every single year there's a story out there, and some areas are affected by droughts for decades. So you're talking about natural disasters. Obviously, you can never predict them. You also talked about commodity super cycles. I think we're actually over that, the most recent one. But there's going to be another one coming up. And we may actually see more manifestations in developing countries. So it is going to happen. So we need to make sure that we have systems in place to respond quickly to these situations. But I'm a big believer in technology. I'm a big believer that we are doing the right research to empower many regions around the world where agricultural capacity needs to increase. I do believe that, whether it's with biotech, machinery, I can go on and on. There's lots of innovation out there, and farmers, frankly, are probably one of the best innovators in the world. They always innovate every single day on their farm, and that needs to be shared more and more. And so essentially, I'm a big believer in that. The other issue I think that needs to be addressed very quickly is immigration and labor laws. Actually, AJ spoke about that. Many economies are closed around the world, and economies change, and they shift more quickly than ever. So when you have a skilled labor force, it may become unskilled or unprepared or ill-prepared for the next economic cycle. So we need to, I think, liberalize our system and allow countries to share human capital as much as possible. Even within Canada, we're having a hard time between provinces to allow people to flow from one province to another. So let alone globally. It's a huge challenge. So labor markets, immigration, and technology, to answer to your question.
You raised an important point, and I think this is quite something that on commodity prices. Why are high food prices bad? I mean, the fact is that from 1980 to about 2008, we basically had food prices that internationally were stable or basically declining. The incentive structure for inward investment was not there. Why would anybody invest, like the private sector or all people? And there was a complacency, even in the public sector, but certainly the private sector was not incentivized to say, well, hang on, there's a buck to be made here. But even the public sector did not invest in research. They did not invest in looking at all the sorts of issues now we're saying we must do. It's because prices were not giving the types of signals. So yes, I mean, we all felt the effects of this great crisis. And I don't believe in the crisis, by the way. I think we've got more than enough capacity and spare capacity and lags within the system to make sure that we will be able to feed everybody. But the point was that we had this, we've disincentivized, if you like, that the way that you should be looking at agriculture and food production, and have also, in the bargain, distorted it. And that's created some of these issues and problems.
Brady.
I will respond a bit here, because what's needed to address some of these issues, of course, is statecraft and resolution of a lot of the regulations and impediments to the flows of capital and labor that you mentioned a moment ago. If you look back at 2007 and 8, for example, and this has been documented in a Foreign Affairs journal, the major commodity prices went up by 50 to 100%, 2007 and 8, in a 3 to 6 month period worldwide. There were prices shot up, and if you look at the labor that had flown into non-agricultural areas, particularly, the numeraire that tells you how much your wage is, of course, is the price of food. And with the food price increases, wage adjustments in the industrial sector could not keep up. You had over 30 violent political changes in government as a result of that sequence of events. And I think this is a challenge we all face, because we can talk about how the market adjusts, and we can talk about how regulations adjust much more slowly often than markets, but yet they drive markets, so there's interaction there that's very, very important. But capturing the dimensions of this across the sectors and from the various types of producers on the agricultural side to get at that dynamic that can continue to create the capital that leads to then the investments in the non-agricultural sector as well, to keep the jobs being created. I mean, there's a complex mix here that we still haven't fine-tuned as economists and business developers and social scientists looking at these adjustments across countries. I think this is one of the most complicated affairs we have. And I think, to your point, most people would really be critical of many of our major global institutions, the World Bank, USAID, totally walking away from agricultural development at a time when they desperately needed to make more investments in agricultural development. That has now been reversed in a major way, and we're seeing some of the good side of that reversal, that we're just into a cycle here. I didn't want to get too abstract about this, but it's very important in terms of us understanding the dimensions of what's happening worldwide, as well as within our own countries and across our own borders. State to state in the United States, my goodness, could talk all day about that. Missouri fighting Kansas, right? I mean, it's just incredible, really.
I think that raises a really important point, because if you looked at this idea of political stability being kind of crucial to food security, if you were to take the FAO data, let's say the 2013 or the 2014 data, and say, what are the countries with the highest prevalence of undernourishment or chronic hunger, and what countries are trending in the wrong direction? So what, instead of decreases, these countries are typically countries where there has been ongoing conflict in them political regions. So Central African Republic, Pakistan. So this political dimension is really important. And when we think about food security and we think about trade and so we do have to really think about it regionally as well as at the country level. So any country can have a drought, and what you need in that situation is you need these these established trade relationships moving affordable food into the region. And so when we look to the future and we think about political stability is important, we can start thinking about borders that share, watersheds, so, countries that are linked together by the things that may be increasingly scarce in the future, river basins. And so I think that's an important issue.
But then, and I don't disagree at all, the well documented throughout history is that where there is food insecurity, where there are food prices that are rising, there is always disruption. Perhaps that says that Canada is going to be entering into a period of disruption if we're continuing to see such a large increase in the number of people accessing food banks. Are we actually seriously at risk, do you think, of?
You know what keeps me awake at night? Let me tell you what keeps me inequalities. I think we're talking more and more about inequalities. I'm a capitalist, I'll admit. I believe in capitalism. Capitalism is good at creating wealth. It is not good at distributing wealth at all. So it needs to be checked all the time. We've made some major mistakes over the last few years, which has enhanced inequalities, I believe. Quantitative easing is one. And I'm in Europe for this year, and again, a couple of weeks ago, Europe decided to adopt quantitative easing measures in Europe, same as what happened in the US. And what happened, it basically allowed people to have access to cheap money to reinvest in stocks. And so you've seen stock prices go up, and who owns stocks? Rich people. So what we've seen over the years is, over the last few years, is this global collective talk about this 1%. Now, should the 1% be blamed? I don't believe so. But we've actually have implemented major fiscal monetary policies that have actually increased inequalities. I think, so are there inequalities out there? I believe so, which actually increases the flow of people going to your food banks. And that's disturbing. But the question I think we need to ask is, how much inequality is too much? And that's the question I don't think anybody has. And we've reached a point where we're going to have to ask corporations to start sharing wealth again. I was actually quite reassured to see Walmart and IKEA yesterday announcing that they're actually raising wages of 500,000 employees. Now, I don't know exactly how that's going to be implemented, but at least it's a signal. And I bet that this is going to continue. If you take the top 30 companies listed on the Dow Jones in New York, there's $7 trillion sitting on balance sheets. That money could go to wages so people can actually earn a better living, I think.
A couple of points. It's an interesting point, but I mean, I was listening to a great fan of BBC World Service, but I was listening to a commentary on it about a few weeks ago, and there were financiers and other people on that particular commentary. And one of the things that struck me was a comment that one of them made was that over the last 8 to 10 years, and also around the fiscal and financial crises that we had about 7, 8 years ago, was that there has been a lot of value trading, but very little value generation. So we haven't had, the emphasis has been hedge funds, basically trading what we already have. To me, not putting labels onto it and saying this or that, to me it's very important that you're not going to have any impacts on poverty reduction, food insecurity, unless you have growth. You can't have poverty reduction and static growth. It just doesn't happen. You're just going to have more and more people who are going to get worse off. And I think the reality of the new world, given the sorts of things that I was talking about, is that where is going to be the relative returns to factors of production, and is it going to be technology, labor, or capital, whatever it is that even in the richer countries, you said you were from, you've spent a year or two in Europe. I mean, I am from Europe. I've lived in Italy for a long time, and I'm from the UK. We're seeing standards falling. I mean, the UK has grown at 3%, but real wages, especially in the north, have been declining. Well, so that tells you that there's nothing, all of this is dynamic. You can't, so all of the safety nets, post-war safety nets, are under threat unless you implement policies that are going to have sustainable, if you like, but you've got to have growth. It's lost its manufacturing sectors. It has relied a lot on financial and financial derivatives, value trading, not value generation. It doesn't have a car industry. So what happens? People in the north, who were manufacturers and the miners and all that, had no skills. The south is quite rich.
I was visiting the FAO last week in Rome, visiting some of your colleagues, and we actually had a discussion about wealth creation around the world. And I was actually talking about my experience coming into Rome by train, and I was quite discouraged to see. I saw thousands of people living in slums in the suburbs of Rome. Rome is a huge city, And so when I came into the FAO at Rome, I actually first said that what I saw. And I spoke to the food safety folks over at the FAO and told them, well, aren't you concerned about that? And the response I got, and I'm explaining this experience so AJ could perhaps respond, is the response I got was, well, the FAO is not overly interested in first world issues. It's mainly focused on third world issues. And when you look at food security, I would argue that it's a global issue. It's everywhere. It's not just in the developing world. It's everywhere. So I don't know if that's accurate or not, but...
I'm sorry, I'm hogging a lot of space, but I have to say something on this. The sense is that, and I think it's coming through, and it'll come through as a trend from our conversation, it's who makes policies. The fact is, look at Italian politics. It's coalition politics, which goes back. It does not make decisive decisions apart from the fact that the North and the South have all sorts of issues, is that where is Italy's trajectory for growth? It hasn't really got, you've got 40% unemployment of graduates. And they are not dealing with those issues. They're dealing with issues, and also, of course, unfortunately, or whatever it is, GDP figures in Italy can go up very high overnight because the black economy, largely controlled, barriers to entry. So this is Europe, where largely they haven't opened up their eyes to reforms. They've got huge issues of structural reforms. And yet, they still think, pensions have to be paid, don't worry about it, look at our debt to GDP ratios, etc. It's just business as usual, and I think, well, hang on. I mean, it's a great life if you work for the UN, but outside that, no, it really is frightening. But it's not just Italy. Look at what's happening in Greece. They've been given another 4 months. They're not going to be able to do it. Yeah. And if you look at the other ones, France, 70%, I mean, I can't remember the exact statistics, but a very high proportion of employment is in the public sector. Mm-hmm. Where is enterprise? The UK is much, much better because it deregulated its economy many, many years ago. So we're going away from food security. But these are interrelated because, to me, I have far more optimism. For example, if policies go in the right direction, you will probably see pretty robust growth in India over the next 10 years. And that will change the complexion of global dynamics in terms of where economics. China has already grown, but it's largely export-led. India's growth will come from its domestic market. And that will have tremendous repercussions, I think, if they can get their acts together.
Great.
Statements about a couple of things. The first of all is, and maybe we can kind of debate some of these issues, but the first is with respect to differences. People are food insecure in Canada, and they're food insecure throughout the world. But there are really big differences when we look at Canada and we look at the situation here, and you say 1.8 million. I guess that's roughly 5% of the population of Canada. And when we're looking at food insecure places in Africa, for example, we can be talking about 30 and 40%. So these really fundamentally, it's a situation everywhere, but there are reasons to focus on some reasons, perhaps with more energy than others. And the second, I want to kind of, give a story that I think really motivates your growth point, which I agree with. And then I want to maybe make a third point about the inequality issue. And the second point is, and this is a story that Larry Summers, always is a well-known economist, always tells about the importance of growth. And he tells the story basically that up until the Industrial Revolution, which historians debate exactly what that happened sometime in the 19th century, that basically per capita income growth was stagnant for thousands of years. And there were ups and downs, but people basically stayed the same. And then you have this Industrial Revolution, and you get these 1% and 2% growth rates. And what that means is over the lifetime of an individual, they might see their family income increase by half, which would have been 40 years, about the lifetime of an individual at the time. And at the time of China, in the last 10 to 20 years, you've seen growth rates of 10%. That means within a decade, you've seen people, which for up until sometime in the 19th century, income hadn't changed at all. You've seen people's family income double in a decade. Now that kind of prosperity, that kind of growth is critical to helping millions and millions of people. And we have to really understand the phenomena. I think it was Einstein, who said something like the continuous compounding of interest is one of the incredible miracles over time. And that's an important point not to lose. Then the question is, though, how do we deal with inequality? Because it's an important issue. And I think it goes back to a point that I want to really hammer on, is that I think that the way we do that is we empower the people that are hungry to the best that we can to overcome, to become more productive, to be able to have the purchasing power, to be able to have the advantage of trading over increasing distances with increasingly unfamiliar agents. And one aspect that I think is important, that is a part of the development literature, and it's long-standing, is to enable them to access the assets which they actually own. So all across developing regions, in urban areas, people have access to real estate that they don't own in a form that they can leverage or feel comfortable with. And so one of the components to more sustainable economic development and growth over time has to be finding ways to empower the entrepreneurial energy of the poor presently. And I think there are some ways that we can talk about more if you want, that we can do that.
To Brady's point, I actually believe that, so we had a credit crisis, we had a debt crisis, we're actually still dealing with a debt crisis, and now I think we're actually experiencing a growth crisis. I think we need to redefine what growth means to our economy. I mean, going back to Brady's point, I mean, what does growth mean? I actually am questioning the revolution of rising expectations. You know, the idea that the next generation should have a greater quality of life than the last one. I mean, I'm thinking of the 9 billion people and so on. I mean, is this realistic?
Well, I just want to say, we're going to focus on 800 million people who are hungry, and the expectation that they have a better life. I mean, that's a starting point. You know, right after that film is made in the United Nations Declaration, I guess it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which, by the way, was authored by a Canadian, it kind of embeds in that the right of people to have access to food. So that expectation, I think, that the world will be better for 800 million people is a principle which I think is widely shared. And I think, so you know, it's in a privileged position, if you say in North America, you know, even then I would argue that people have an expectation for a better future. I know I do for my own children.
Mm-hmm. So I'm before Brady steps in, because he's been trying to, I suppose this is the time to say, in addition to that, of course, I hope everybody here realizes that FAO was actually formed in Canada, which I have to say that I did not realize. I'm in Montreal, yes. So
I was just going to add a word in this dialogue. I think is very rich here, where we are right now. But for particularly all the students in the audience here, if you had put a panel like this together in 1949, 59, or 69 and said, what's the world going to look like in 2015, you would not at all have anyone pointing to where we are today. The incredible growth in China, which most experts thought was impossible, actually, not very many years ago, has been phenomenal. China now consumes half of the world's pork production, for example. Little things like that just sort of blow your mind, which says that it's going to continue to change. And this is what the richness of this discussion, I think. There's going to be enormous changes occurring in the next few years, driven by new science and technology and knowledge. And the focus that this organization, and Alistair, that you've helped lead here in such an important way, is to focus on those in extreme poverty. Let's find the variety of ways through coalitions and partnerships and the application of science and technology to the entire value chain in agricultural production and to the interface between agricultural and the non-agricultural sector. So then, if we continue to do that, and I'm drawing on John Rawls' philosophy here a bit, if we continue to address the needs of the most disadvantaged, we can then, through knowledge, find ways to be more successful in building a better world. And I think that's a challenge. And if I were a student in the audience today, I'd be very excited, because you're going to come up with stuff that we've never even thought about at this point within the next decade, the next 2 decades.
I would just add that I think that's where there's some real opportunity to really be able to look ahead, think through, and then create a future. And we look at what has happened here in Canada over the last 10, 15, 20 years. There was no plan that we would start to lose higher quality, higher paying jobs in forestry, manufacturing, fishery. And yet that's what's happened. And while we are creating jobs in this country, they're lower paid jobs, often in the service sector. They're part-time, they're temporary, they're low paid, and that's why we're seeing so many people come for help. And then the second piece of that is our social safety nets aren't high enough for people to then be able to improve their lives. I mean, try to live on $8,000 a year on an ongoing basis. It's almost impossible in terms of that social
that takes
assistance.
us right back to Ajay's comment about you need something more than the approach we're having at the moment. When we take great pride in the number of jobs that are being produced, we are not at all talking about any value that is being produced in that process. Yeah. I'm going to take that as a point that we might open up the discussion to the people in the audience. There is a microphone in the middle, and if you would like to make your way to the microphone, you can either ask a question that is directed at an individual on the panel, or you could ask it to a group of people on the panel. And I'll keep talking until somebody decides that they're going to stand up and go and be at the microphone. But if you would kindly just introduce yourself, so that, and perhaps where you come from, so we would have a context.
Hi, I'm Mary, and I live in Guelph. I studied sociology here, and then I studied in Germany at the University of Göttingen. And thank you for being here. It's been very interesting to listen to what you all have to say about very important problems. And I really enjoyed seeing that film, and I guess a quote that I took away from that is, freedom can't be built on empty stomachs. One of the things that we haven't brought up, or you all haven't brought up, is the issue of biofuels and growing food and growing biofuels. So I'll leave this open to anyone on the panel to address. So do you foresee any challenges in the future between growing food for fuel and growing food for people?
Somebody want to?
I think, again, that's a good point. I mean, that's a very interesting question, because I think part of the hikes in food prices that we had in 2008, it wasn't any singular factor that started to do this. We had what's called a tsunami effect. We had failure in major producing countries like Russia and Australia, for example, on the wheat markets. Then we also had this whole debate of, well, a lot of land has been diverted away towards biofuels, etc. Is it or not? I don't think that I have seen any. There was quite a lot of work done it, and FAO did a lot of work on this, and they did signal that this may be an issue going into the future. But to me, there's so much slack in the system that, again, it's determined by price. And if prices are right, you're going to have responses. This is how supply responds. And if, for example, now the question is fracking going to be economical in the US if oil prices keep falling? And the industry is now worried a little bit. So the same thing applies to biofuels, etc. I mean, if the prices are right, they will respond to it. And you have to look at food in relation to that. But I'm always careful in saying that we don't produce enough, because if you look at how much we waste, 40% of post-production losses in developing countries, 50%, 60%. It's because of a lack of investment in supply chains. That's doable. If you give the right incentive structures. And to me, well, that's my personal, well, certainly it is now a very strong belief, it's not something that the state should do. Let the private sector come in and do this. And part of the problems has been, and supply chains and in the whole food system, is that the state has tried. I mean, again, I give you the example of India. It's riddled with a lot of state enterprises that really should not be there. I think if you start to dismantle that, get the policies effectively going in the right direction, you're going to see efficiencies right through the system. The other thing I just wanted to pick up on what Brady said is that looking at the comparisons between emerging economies and some of the emerging economies in, say, Europe and the traditional richer countries is demographics. Japan is aging. Germany is aging. Italy is aging. Italy is next to Japan in terms of the demographic bomb. The dependency ratio between, they don't, and again, for political reasons, there's a whole issue of migration skills, bringing people in, apart from the fact that they don't actually have a strategy as to how they're going to look at what they want to develop. So demographically, countries like India's population, 70% are under 35. The dynamics is different. They're energetic. They want to change things. They want to go for things. The ratio of people who are going into higher education is a big thing. In Italy, we've got 40% undergraduates who don't get jobs. You've got to rethink this. But to me, it comes back to the role that policymakers make and what they should not and should do, and the incentive structures they put for the wider economy. And I think a lot of this can come through. I'm certainly not depressed about not having enough food. I think we can easily have it. Technology is there. The slack in the system can be addressed. I just don't believe that we've got this time bomb happening.
I just say, though, I don't disagree with this, except to say that the demand for food is growing at quite a rapid pace with the growth in income, particularly. People are eating better, they're eating more calories. And for the science and technology of that entire process, still, we have to keep foot on the accelerator there and even increase it, I think. And it's always surprising if you, I've just, with a few of my colleagues, I've recently been saying, where do you think the 9 billion population will be distributed? Where is it now? People have very vague conceptions of where the world's population of 7.3 billion, I believe it is now, where are they in the world? So I'll just urge all of you, go back to your Google and just Google and see where it is. You'll surprise yourself. And the magnitude of population, Indonesia and Nigeria, and the fact that by 2050 in Nigeria, it's expected that there will be a billion population below 18 years old. I mean, the job creation implications of that and the investment potential. Yes, there's no way we're going to create state power to do all that. It's going to take a partnership. And I think developing a new sense of that partnership is absolutely critical between state action, private sector action, the entrepreneurship that's needed, and I would add, importantly, the collective aspect of entrepreneurship. Nothing's done in a vacuum. It all takes rules, and you've got to have the rules of society functioning to address these key needs, or it's not going to happen. The market alone doesn't do it.
Barbara, do you want to?
I'm Barbara Murphy from the University of Maine, and a common theme throughout all of the talk today is the only way to address hunger is to address poverty, and the way to address poverty is growth, and growth means more consumption, yet we're already consuming more than one planet today. So how is the growth, hunger, poverty thing all going to work based on more consumption?
Yep.
Well, let me just repeat part of the emphasis I was trying to make. I totally agree with you. And I think we have to really focus on the growth potential of smallholder agriculturalists worldwide. That's got to be a sustained commitment. That requires new technologies, new science, new value chain analyses. And I think USAID, Canadian government, governments in various parts of the world, along with African governments, particularly where the problem is the most acute right now, have recognized that irrespective of the big macro changes and the fact that China is eating so much better today, irrespective of all that, you have to place a focus, I think, on smallholder development. And I think economic theory, in my mind, stands firmly behind that to create the kind of transition, capital formation, the ability to send your children to school. I mean, I grew up on a subsistence farm in eastern Kentucky, and I can speak from firsthand about what that means in terms of the risks you take or can't take, and how then you engage in a technology transfer process. So I appreciate your emphasis.
I think it's a very important question that you're asking. Going back to actually an earlier comment I made about defining what growth means to all of us from now on, moving forward. I do believe that consumers will change ways, or their relationship with goods and services will change over time. Let me give you an example. There's this trend towards plant-based protein going on around the world. In fact, there was a study that came out, I think it was last month, suggesting that over the next 20 years, we should see the global demand for plant-based protein increase by 43%. That's actually quite reassuring, because if we're looking at China with hogs and pork, and we look at India, and we look at different countries where they've developed this humongous appetite for protein, no point intended. I mean, I'm not sure it's sustainable. As Canadians, we love our beef, we love our chicken, we love our pork, but I think we're going to be reaching a point that we may not be able to afford buying our steak every single week. And in fact, prices for bacon and beef has gone up significantly last year, and actually I think that's a good thing. I think it actually sends a signal to the consumer in how much animal production actually costs. So I think over time you'll see growth defined in a different way. We'll be buying different products. But I actually do believe there is such a thing as too much innovation. And I walk into a grocery store. There's so many SKUs now. It's amazing. There's all sorts of products being offered to you that companies are just having a hard time finding new ways to attract the consumer. The consumer is absolutely confused right now with gluten-free and all the different types of Coke is going into milk. Milk! Is there something more wholesome and natural than milk? Why? Because they're going back to the basics. Now, I'm not sure if it's actually going to work, but that's another signal that I find very interesting. Coke going into milk with a cooperative, with a dairy cooperative from, I think it's either from Missouri or Wisconsin. But it's an interesting concept. And so it's going to happen more and more. A lot of multinationals will be questioning how they actually do business and interact with consumers.
I'm glad you explained that, because as you were talking about it, I was thinking fizzy brown milk would be disgusting. Dan.
Thank you.
Yeah. One thing, I think that's a very good question, I think, essentially, but listen, as I said to my kids, I mean, life isn't fair, but get used to it. The point that I think we have to do is, again, I come back to this idea of responsible policy making, because there's always going to be a trade-off. Do you intensify? Do you not intensify? In a dynamic setting, because of course we are relying on technological change underpinning some of the things that we've been talking about in the employment equation, in the production equation, on whatever it is. But I do believe that there is still sufficient slack that if we can still do efficiencies which would be neutral. They will not have an impact on, say, resources and whatnot. I just wanted to say one more thing that I think, Rady, you made, which is quite an interesting one. The last couple of years, the World Bank and FAO has been doing a study on agricultural productivity in India. And our studies, looking at national data with the National Council for Applied Economic Research in Delhi, has shown that essentially smallholder agriculture is unviable. They're being pushed out. That's a demographic time bomb. Basically, they're being marginalized. They cannot. It just does not give them an income potential that is going to mean that they're going to be able to subsist even. So down the line, and we've also seen that this inverse relationship between farm size and productivity, when you look at profitability, shows that larger farms do actually better than smaller farms because of not factor productivity, but total factor productivity. You're looking at things outside what we normally used to look at. And I think that shows, at least we want to make policymakers aware. You've got to look at issues, structural issues in agriculture differently. You've got to have consolidation of one way or the other. You can't rely on smallholder agriculture being able to meet the types of demands that a growing economy and a huge market is going to do. So again, it takes us back into taking all of our advocacy works, universities, institutions like MAC, but actually trying to make sure that people listen and act on it. And that's been our problem. I mean, a lot of this has existed for an awful long time. It's taking knowledge and advocacy to action, and that's been a failure in my opinion.
I'm going to move on because we've now got a whole line of people.
Sorry.
So Dan?
Should I identify myself?
Please.
My name is Dan Silverstein. I'm a private sector and capital markets consultant in agricultural development, and I'm going to be one of the speakers tomorrow on a panel. And one of the topics I'm going to talk about is the capital markets. And I'm not going to say many nice things about how the capital markets intersect poor people throughout the world. which is a response to some of what was discussed here. But my comment is as I've listened to this conversation, which I think is really wonderful and has evolved over a series of topics. With your permission, I want to bring it back to the beginning, if I may, and think as a student looking for the portal through which you will find your place in this comprehensive issue of how to address hunger and food security. I had a reaction when I saw the film that, and please don't judge me by this, that it was a cynical attempt by rich nations to create an environment in which farmers would have a guaranteed market access for their products by providing them to poor people who are unable to sustain themselves, which serves a transitory purpose, but doesn't really lead to solving the problem. And as what really triggered me to stand up here and make this comment was Dr. Deaton's comment about the collapse of agricultural development and food aid through the 70s and 80s. And we know very well about an annual report, a report by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs about renewing American leadership, but by extension, rich nation leadership in agricultural development. And so for me, this conversation has really dealt with the existential issues that are the difference between food aid and agricultural development, and the role that each plays in addition to the role that food banks play. Because there seems to me there's a distinct difference between what a food bank does by providing free food and what farmers in highly productive countries do by providing free food. And I know that all of you, particularly the Food and Agriculture Organization, deals every day with the issue of undermining the cost, the value of farmers' productivity. And so with that long explanation, I wanted to just simply bring this conversation back to its essential components for students to think about what their role is.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Robert Wahlberg. I'm with a company right now. We're actually introducing some good news technology. It takes food waste and through an insect called the black soldier fly, it can convert it into animal protein or into a protein that can go into livestock. And so there's an issue there that's going to be have quite a big impact on the world food supply through producing livestock feed from this food waste. But my question is going back to the problem here. In 1949, it seemed like a light bulb went on. And I had a little bit different reaction than Dan to the movie. I actually felt like there was some moral impulse in these people that were trying to solve a problem there. I felt like there was sincerity. Maybe I'm just seeing the glass half full, half empty sort of thing. But the problem, I think we're misinterpreting or maybe what the problem is and what the symptoms are. The problem, I don't think we've identified yet. The symptoms, that we got hungry people. The problem is these people weren't able to produce their own food. And this gentleman, Brady, on the end here has touched on this a couple times. And it seems to me that the common sense thing would be to work with the people rather than, we need the moral impulse like the food banks. That's a damage control for the problem. We're going to have to keep feeding people as they get hungry or disasters and stuff like that. But to look at the bigger issue, I don't think it's been identified yet. I'm not very good at articulating. I'm not an academic here, so I'm a little bit nervous in front of all you folks, so just have patience with me. But I don't think the problem has actually been identified yet, and that's, I think, one of the reasons. The solution that was projected in 1949 was a plausible solution because we could produce enough food back then for the number of people. It's not even on the table now. We can't produce enough food. There's not enough fish in the oceans to feed 9 billion people. So we can't go with that approach anymore. We need that approach on the moral side to feed people that are hungry, that are caught in these situations until we catch up. But there's issues like, there was a gentleman, Hans Rosling, I don't know if anybody's heard of him, he's a researcher out of Sweden. He went down to the ground level. We're all looking at this situation from our first world and looking down on these people and their problems. He went into Africa and he worked with some of these villages, and he found that the number one thing that could take somebody out of the extreme poverty was a bicycle. And he started introducing bicycles into these little families that were out in the middle of nowhere. That enabled the kids to go to school because they weren't spending all their time getting water. It's these simple things from the ground up. And there's been projects with honeybees being introduced on the farm level. And I think the solution, forgive me for taking so long here, but I think the solution has to come back to addressing the problem, which we haven't identified yet, which is these people who are hungry, who can't produce their own food, who can't sustain themselves. We've got to go back and help on that level with the same moral impulse that the food banks are doing, a parallel attack on the problem of, it's not going to happen through government probably, it's going to happen through initiatives like the food bank, where we're bringing bicycles into these communities for that, and we're maybe, anyways, so I'd like either Rady or Catherine to hit on this a little bit more, please.
To your point, and on a very micro level, we're seeing food banks more and more provide services and support to do just that, to help them get back on their feet. Whether it's linking them to other services to help with whatever the key issue is that has brought them to the food bank, whether it's helping them with life skills, job search skills. About 50% of the food banks are providing education and training on how to shop more economically, nutrition courses, all of those kinds of things that are helping build their capacity, their level of confidence, all happening at the food bank. So they're coming to the food bank because they're hungry, but we know that we're having a much bigger impact on their lives and helping them to get back on their feet. So a very micro example of, I think, what you're talking about.
What the bike may represent, it's an asset. And what it does, to some extent, it unleashes the creative capacity of that individual. You don't know where that guy or gal is going to go when they get that bike. But they go someplace that can't be anticipated. It unleashes that creative capacity, and empowering individuals in ways that we cannot fully anticipate has to be one component of the problem. Now let me say, if that person is hungry, having the nutrition, and this gets to the food bank and to the aid questions, to pedal that bike is a component of the problem. Hernando de Soto has a great saying, and I think it's relevant when we get back to this creative, that bike unleashing the creative capacity of that individual. If you want it, you have a great idea. You're in a developing country and you have a great idea for a business. And the first thing that they might ask is, what's your address? And if you don't have formal ownership of property or even relatively secure ownership of property, then that ability to leverage another asset, in this case the land that you live on or the slums outside of major cities, that's diminished. And so I like the bike example, and I think it underpins the key sustainable solution, and that will be unleashing the creative capacity of the people that are most diminished in the current setting, the current situation.
I'm going to cut you off, if I may, Robert, because I need to let the other people get to ask questions.
My name is Johnny Kashama, PhD.
You may have to be nearer to the microphone, can you? Because we can't hear you. Just get your lips nearer to that's right.
Okay, so PhD candidate in food science and former senior food security officer of Action Against Hunger of the United States. So my question is this, it's for Mr. Markande. So International Food Policy Research Institute, objectives in 2000, so Vision to 2020. So my question is this, are we getting there in the eradication of poverty and increase of food security? So the second question is to Mr. Charlebois. So you said that capitalism is good because it creates wealth, but it needs to be checked because it is not good in sharing or distributing the wealth. So my question is this: what are the policies that can be, set up so that those people who have money can share their wealth?
Okay.
Okay, the question that you put to me, I think, looking at the film clip that we did earlier, I mean, we've throughout history had visions. So in 1949 or whatever, there was a vision. We had global leaders. They came together. They basically looked at the scenario globally at that time, and they said, we need to go forward. I mean, it's the realization of the vision, which I think is the most important thing. And that's much, much more complicated, because the singularity of purpose, one of the reasons that globally things don't come together is because of the congruence of domestic and international policies. Domestic constituents drive domestic policies. Whether that translates into an international global good or not is a very difficult transition to make. And so when you go back onto these types of things like the Compact 2025 or the Agenda for Nutrition 2025, there are a lot of those. I'm not sure, yes, okay, fine, it gives you a sense that globally we are trying to look at it. But what are the instruments you're going to use to make sure that you deliver on those global public goods? And I am not convinced that they exist. And I don't see anything changing. I think, again, we go back onto some of the discussions we had earlier, is that if you address some of the market failures that go on, if you I don't think population is just going to continue rising. I think there will be, and I think even most projections show after 2016, it'll start to decline for all sorts of reasons. So I think there's an interim period where we're looking at a bit of a demographic bomb, but it will reconstitute, it'll restructure into a different way. How we ride that is again a political question, and I think that takes us back into saying, how do you take all of this and make people act on it?
Savan?
Yeah, just quickly to answer your question. So, yes, I do believe that capitalism works, but it's not efficient at distributing wealth properly. And Mark Carney actually said recently that capitalism is not inclusive, and I actually agree with him. Going back to the inequality issue, I do believe now the system actually favors the rich people, and so we need to keep in mind how do we make sure that everyone is engaged in our economies overall. So through wages, of course, we're in the business of education, so I'm a big believer in education. Most importantly, and this is something we haven't talked about all that much tonight, is women. The role of women in education. In many studies suggest that the biggest, the most efficient economic driver there is education to women around the world. That's one way to actually make capitalism more inclusive.
I don't know if anybody else picked it up, but for me, my initial response was to be depressed when I saw the film. And then I actually reflected that the number of times the presenter said a group of men has gathered together, a group of men has decided, a group of men this, and you probably don't have the same kind of overview that I have, but of the 23 speakers at this summit, 6 of them are men. And so perhaps we do have a better proportion of women who are coming up, who will be able to make the kind of changes and make the kind of commitments and ongoing commitment to change that men have failed to do.
This is a great point, I think, Alistair. I mean, the 2012 SOFA was gender in agriculture. FAO, through its empirical research, data showed why investment in women in agriculture has a great dividend. What happened? Yeah. So again, advocacy and knowledge to action, that's to meet the critical part of it? How do you, it's, you know, and as an institution, as an advocacy institution, as a multilateral institution, yes, we try to put it onto the global agendas and the intergovernmental groups, but we can't force people to act on it.
Tom?
Just following up kind of on that theme, my question is about smart policy and communication. This is a really great high-level dialogue, and I'm sure we could fix all the world's problems if we had enough time, but we all know implementation is everything. So how do we take these inherently complex ideas and simply communicate them? Because it seems that when we try to simplify complexity, that's where we do the most damage. So I'm wondering, how do we advocate for positive solutions?
Well, I think one of the things that gets back to this point of men and women is to look at policies that are working and at small levels and potentially try to scale them up, and also look at policies that are not working. So when we look at providing assets to low-income people that allow them to creatively address their constraints, we can look to policies, for example, in Peru, like titling, and there's land reform going all over the world. And some of it works, some of it doesn't work. There's a great debate on it. But understanding and looking at situations that work and then trying to replicate those. So we have policies, projects that are going around that try to increase and enhance land governance systems. Some of these have been effective, others haven't, learning from those lessons. But what's important about those subset of policies is that they're targeted at empowering the individual. And for students, it's important to know what's going on in your backyard. So I always, in my teaching, First Nations land reform in Canada, there's a number of issues that are ongoing that are important lessons to be learned and that are important for thinking about international development. In the United States, there's land reform going on. There's a Uniform Partition Heirs Act looking at inheritance of land and targeted in a way to address the vulnerability of low-income homes. So that would be that's those clear sets of policies, assessing them. There's currently lots of debate about them, but targeting into what the other gentleman said, targeting them in a way to focus on what enhances the capacity of low-income people to overcome their constraints.
Ready?
I said two basic points I'd add to this. One is the philosophy that's been undertaken by USAID on the whole of government approach, so that our Agency for International Development draws on all components of government. BIFAD said, okay, we'll draw on all components of the university to match that, and we can then deliver in ways that we did not before. And a great part of that is to strengthen and empower the various non-governmental organizations that are working at the grassroots level with the people in communities around the world. The second major aspect of it is another emphasis we've been making is on building the capacity in those countries, those developing countries where the problems of hunger and poverty are so prevalent, build the capacity in the educational institutions and so that they can be self-sustaining over time, so that we have a form of assistance, so to speak, that phases itself out of existence as quickly as possible. That's the most effective aid policy.
I think here in Canada, if we think about social policy, one of the things that I think we've been weak on for the last 50, 60 years is our approach to our conversations with government around poverty. So we've taken more of an activist approach in the past as opposed to sitting down and having good conversation about potential solutions that are very balanced. And that's one of the things that Food Banks Canada is really working on, is having a different type of dialogue with government to be able to see some social change.
Thank you. Can we move on to the next questioner? Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Cameron Ogilvie. I'm a student of agriculture here. Actually, just to continue on with the comment that you just made, I live on Willow Road in Guelph, and a lot of my friends fall into the social safety net, which, as you've mentioned, is insufficient in a number of ways, and they are accessing food banks for these resources. And some of the complaints that are made is, so we need to raise the minimum wage for these people to be able to work and to afford these things. But the other thing that I'm realizing that is that in Guelph, the cost of living relatively is quite high compared to other cities. And so that's another factor to it. So to touch on another question that was asked, are these issues symptoms of the level that we are consuming is having negative downstream impacts on other people in our society? And from a Canada Food Bank perspective, where is the issue within our system where policies need to be better serving to these members of society?
So to the point made earlier that the symptom is hunger and people having to go to food banks. What is the real reason for that in Canada? And it does come down to income and having enough income to be able to access that safe quality food, which Brady you talked about as well. And why is that happening? Almost every individual or family that comes to a food bank cites that their key challenge is affordable housing. And by the time they can pay for a safe place to live, there's not a whole lot left. And in some cases, 60, 70, even 80% of their income, whether it's income from employment or whether they're on a disability pension or they're getting social service or social support, is going into just finding, as you said, you're living Willow Road, right? It's a real challenge, and it comes down to income and access.
But we are, sorry, Brady, go ahead.
Let me just kind of, because I think you're asking for clear policy directions here that you can take. So I think you hit an important point. This is important both in developing countries and in developed countries when it comes to having the capacity to purchase food, which is the way most of your friends are probably dealing. It's not a production issue for them. And the question is, why is rent so high? And so you can look at all sorts of urban planning decisions. You can look at the surplus of why are students living on the south side and paying exorbitant rents? What is it about government planning over time that has maybe not lowered rents to the extent that you would like them? This is an area, and I'm not answering the question what have Guelph's policies have done, but this is a clear area, and it's important. The way you've addressed it is important because it gives you a clear venue. What is the relationship between decisions that influence, for example, student housing provision in the downtown city or out in the areas? How much do we have? That radically affects the rental rates, and that substantively affects the second component that we have to think about, and that's the capacity to purchase food. Where those rental rates are high, where zoning measures have not allowed enough housing to be developed, students pay very high rents, and they don't have the capacity to purchase food.
I think it's a little bit more complicated than that. Catherine would know that there are more and more people visiting food banks that have very large houses and 2 cars. Now, why is that? They have assets, but they can't feed themselves, so they visit food banks in Kitchener, actually. And that's the reality. We're often victims of market failures. Plants closing down. This country has lost over 140 food manufacturing plants over the last 6 years. That's 26,000 jobs, well-paid jobs. From one day to the next, they don't have a job. They go to food banks.
The Canadian Payroll Society does an annual research, and 80% of Canadians are one paycheck away from having trouble. So you are correct, Sylvain, that we do see people who have big homes and cars. It's short term because they've got to make some pretty big changes pretty quick. But we're living on the edge. A lot of us are living on the edge.
It's not just students, it's really more than that.
But you have to look at it, and just to catch it, he was asking a question about students. And each one of these things will have a different problem. So he says...
Not necessarily about students, no.
No, but you were giving an example of students that you know have to go and pay.
Oh, no, these aren't students.
Just students, okay. So that may be the question, though. The rent question is relevant there. The question that you're talking about with somebody with a house and 2 cars may be a very different question. There may be a credit card debt. I don't know what these situations are. And I'd also be interested in how prevalent that is.
It's short term. Well, it's the example that you hear, right?
Yeah.
You'll hear people say, people are abusing food banks. Well, I can tell you, if someone can afford to pick at the Wheaties that they want to, the type of Wheaties they want, they're going to go and buy it. But there are definitely situations where people were doing fine one day and they're not the next day. And yes, they do have a big house and a couple of cars, but I can assure you that that changes pretty quickly.
I'm going to move on because we have one more question and I want to make sure we can respect the time.
I'm going to say, I'm going to flatter and say, save the last for the best, if no one is going to be behind me. We were talking about hunger today, and we had great discussion, I suppose, but when I entered this hall, the first picture I saw was an African child in a feeding center, which doesn't actually reflect the continent of Africa, which feeds into the stereotype that hunger only exists in Africa, which is not actually the case, and which I expected this great institution would will not feed into that stereotype. So I'm a little bit disappointed that actually University of Guelph would choose those pictures of African kids in a feeding center. The main thing that happened in Africa, or I would say why there's hunger, is instability, bad governance, no fair trade with the developed countries or with the rich countries. So that's what that's a comment I have, and the economists maybe would say something about this. The rich nations sometimes they have subsidies for their farmers, and they would not accept the same subsidies that they have in these rich countries for those poor countries in Africa, in Latin America, or in Asia, I would say. Also, the foreign food aid also feeds into the problem of hunger in Africa, because sometimes rich nations actually will give food aid to these countries and disincentivize the farmers actually to produce, because the food aid would be flooded in the market and the farmers have no incentive to actually produce food, because people will buy cheap food in the market. So even though we talked about a lot of things, but I think politics, the environment, would be something that we didn't actually talk about. And stability is one thing I think that has problems in Africa, which contributes to this hunger and starvation and famine, this and that.
Let me just emphasize the point that you made earlier. If you look at the countries that have the highest rates of undernourishment, and you look at then the countries in the last 5 years who have trended in the wrong direction, there are countries in Africa, there's countries, Haiti, Central African Republic, Pakistan, Afghanistan. So your point's well taken. These are places all around the world. And many of these countries are characterized by political uncertainty. So.
And to your point about subsidies, absolutely. I mean, subsidies distort trades, creates an uneven playing field. Canada's to blame. I mean, we have supply management here. We have a lot of supply-driven policies to support our farmers. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong in supporting our farmers, but we live in a global system, and sometimes our focus is very, very narrow, unfortunately.
I think one of the aspects of the questions that have come at the end is that it's just underscored again the complexity of these issues at home and abroad, the challenges of dealing with the 805 million who are absolutely living with abject hunger, versus how does one actually create a sustainable solution or set of solutions worldwide that deal with inequality, deal with the need for us to have effective growth. I would like to ask you to thank the panelists for the time that they have spent. And I'm sure that for those of you who still have burning questions, you would be welcome to come down and join us. The dinner this evening, for those of us who are part of the conference, starts at 7:30. I'm looking at Paula. It starts at 7:30. For those of you who are not familiar, it's in Creelman Hall, which is, if you go out of the door here, you will find, out of the main door of Rosansky Hall, you will find signs that direct you towards Creelman. Despite the cold, it's only about a 4-minute walk, and look forward to seeing you then. Yes. Thank you again, everybody, for your participation.